Hello, parents and teachers who may be watching. Welcome to Creating Math Ahas for Parents. I'm Dr. Sandy Atkins Sandy. And as I said in the last video, I love geometry. Geometry is just fun to me. It's real world. And in that video, we looked at how to take a paper circle, such as this, and fold it into, well, I called it a truncated tetrahedron at the end. So it looked like this. So we went from the circle to this. And it gives us a lot of opportunity to talk about geometry terminology. But we tend to think of geometry as something you do as the child gets older, moves up in the grades. But you know, it's one of the best things to do with young children. Now, in math, we tend to think the higher the number, the more difficult. And that's not always the case. 300 divided by 3 is much simpler than 5 divided by 3. Larger numbers don't actually make it more difficult. In geometry, because of the way some of the books that are available start with 2D, we tend to think 2D is simpler than 3D. But the child's world is full of 3D objects. They see it in the groceries, whether it's canned goods or box goods, or they see cones out on the playground. They play with ball shapes, spheres. So their world is a 3D world. Two-dimensional shape really is something in your mind's eye because it has no thickness. Now, one thing, we can have children playing with blocks. These are some blocks that I have. And for your young child, it's wonderful. Let me just clear these and try not to make too much noise, yeah? It's wonderful for them just to explore and play with blocks and see what will stack, right? What actually can't stack, as far as I can't put anything on top of that pyramid or that cone. And I've watched a young child try to put a sphere, a ball shape, on the tip of the cone and worked and worked and worked. It was great. And then she worked out, nope, it can't be done. Now that's powerful because that will be memorable for her. Now, here's a shape that quite often the children will put on top when they're playing, and they think that's the end. They can't build any higher with that shape. See, with this triangular prism, I might not be able to stack another one when it's turned that way, but I can when it's turned that way. We want to make sure that your child has a chance to flexibly play around with these shapes and just start to explore which of these shapes will roll, not just balls, but cylinders will roll, which shapes will stack, some of the characteristics of the shape. Now, we might play simple games with your children in school. We might have them roll a die or spin a spinner. If your child's quite young, pre-K, it could just have 1, 2, or 3 dots. And the idea is if I'm playing with another person or 2 or 3 people, let's say we roll a 3 or spin a 3, we take turns each selecting a block until we each have a total of 3 blocks. And then we see who could make the tallest tower or the longest tower. So you see, I don't want one child to pick all 3 blocks because they might pick all the tallest ones. But if they pick these 3, they might find that they're a little limited in what they can build, right? But we play games where they can build, they get some strategies of which ones they want to do. Now, I know some folks who just in centers in their classroom have pictures of very famous buildings, things like Eiffel Tower, structures, right? Taj Mahal, and the kids build with their blocks the structures that match those. Now, lets us see what the child sees and lets them really start to attune to some detail. So it's not that they're making an identical replica, but they're actually building structures with blocks and learning about the attributes of blocks. That's what it will look like for your young children. Now, there are some important things to remember as you work with your children. One is using the correct names from the beginning. I know that I've seen some books, some stories where they've talked about the moon being a circle. It's not a circle. A circle is a two-dimensional word, right? The moon is spherical. So we don't want to call a 3D shape by a 2D shape name. The other thing, if you look at these, I've heard folks talk about these two shapes as a thick circle and a thin circle. Circles have no thickness. They're two-dimensional. See, it's a little more complex. These are both cylinders. So these are both three-dimensional shapes. One could be a thin cylinder and a thick cylinder if you want, but we want to be very careful with what we use in terms of our names and in how we talk about it. Now, some folks will say, well, how about paper? Paper's very thin. It's very thin, but it also has a thickness, okay? So paper, you know, this is pretty thin on its own, but if it didn't have thickness, it wouldn't get this thick. So it's important that we talk about, if we talk about a clock on the wall, the typical clock, that's not a circle, it's a circular shape perhaps, but it's a cylinder. We want to call those ball shapes spheres. We want your young child to hear that terminology from the very beginning. Now, some other things you can do. I've talked about building with them structures. You can see that on this one, it's got some, I had play type dough, right? Salt dough, other types of Play-Doh, where we actually make impressions. So we use Play-Doh a lot. But one thing we can do is have the child see a shape, and they actually try to make the shape with some type of dough. Now, the important thing when they make the shape, challenge them to try to make it the same size shape, same size, same thickness. Just by making that little distinction, it has them build more of a critical eye. Now, once they build it, they can start to see, oh, yes, that's about the right size. It's hard, of course, with dough to get the exact shape, but they'll start to notice corners, vertices. They start to see faces, right? They look at corners, vertices versus edges. So we challenge them to make it the same size and shape using Play-Doh. Now, there's one level of difficulty when I can see the shape I'm making, because I can keep comparing. If you want to make it more challenging for your child as they get more comfortable with this, I use bags. I must like the color blue today, eh? Now, this is a bag. You could use socks. And in this case, you just put different shapes. It doesn't matter. You could use your small canned goods and box shapes that are up in your cupboard, right? But I can put a shape in here. And what you do is you have the child feel through the bag at the shape, and then they try to make it the exact same, again, size and shape. Now, notice we're moving from visually looking at attributes. So I'm visually looking to tactily, to feel what those attributes, and I start to notice different things. So I'm feeling through the bag or the sock, I'm trying to build it again, and when I'm through, I pull out that shape and look. Now, the one thing that's important for your child to understand is once they pull it out and look at it, they can always fix it, so to speak, right? They can revise what they've done. They can try to make it a little closer to size and shape. And we do that quite often in math. Once we get more information, we revise what we're doing. So I can use socks. I can use bags to hide these shapes in. I can have them build with the shapes. I want to use the correct shape names, whether it's cylinder or cone. I can talk about prisms that have the thickness, whether it's this is a hexagonal, a triangular, a rectangular prism, right? I've got cylinders, I've got pyramids. Here are other triangular prisms. Now, you can mix it in with measurement again. the tallest tower, the longest structure, right? One that will have a point at the top, an apex. Okay. Now, one other thing, just for your information, right? We have two pyramids here. One thing about pyramids, what's common is they will have an apex, that point on the top, and we name them by their base. So this is a triangular pyramid. This is a square pyramid, rectangular pyramid. I could have a hexagonal pyramid, where that's the base. It comes to a point, to the apex. So what's common with pyramids are their other faces, right, are all triangular, but we name them by their base. So those are things that they start to notice as they play. But for your young children, pre-K, K, even grade 1, really what we want to do is think about starting with 3D shape. Don't shy away from it, because as we saw with something as simple as this, sometimes if we're not careful, we set up the children to have some misunderstandings with geometry. And we want from the very beginning to make sure that they are clear that we don't call spheres circles, right? That we don't call cylinders circles necessarily. We want them to be cylinders. The other thing is when we're talking about these things, I'm going to give you one other example with that precision. It's really important. I have some kids, and I will confess right now, my drawings are not going to be as precise as they might, as they probably should be, right? But I want you to think about these two shapes. We have many children that think that these are two different shapes. Squares are squares, rectangles are rectangles. Rectangles must be oblong, they think. And part of that is the way that they're introduced to shapes. And think about those storybooks again. Quite often they have circle, triangle, and square in it. And then we introduce the rectangle as the new shape, an oblong. But what's really important for children to understand is this is a rectangle. It happens to be a rectangle with equal sides. Okay, so as we're going through with these, this is a rectangular prism. This is a rectangular prism, as is this. These just happen to be ones with congruent faces. These also are called cubes. So a rectangular prism doesn't necessarily have to have that oblong in it. We can have cubes. Rectangles don't have to just be oblong. So if you have time this summer, things that they can play with, whether it's summer or during the year, is blocks. But you notice how I'm using blocks that don't connect. These are different from like a Lego or a linking block, because we get to look at the characteristics more when they don't necessarily connect. Things that stack, things that will slide, things that will roll. And that's what we want them to know about the 3D shapes. Those characteristics become very important as they go up through the grades and start to prove things about shapes. But it all begins with play. So if you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing. It's free for this channel right now. So subscribe, click on that notifications bell so you know when new videos are coming. And I hope you have some fun playing with your children, using blocks, using some type of a modeling dough, Play-Doh, getting them to start to play around with shape and notice those attributes. Thanks so much for watching.